Good morning, everyone. Hope everyone has finished up their week almost. It's Friday morning. So today I'm actually going to follow on a little bit from yesterday. We talked about a fallacy, the accident fallacy. Fallacies are so interesting because after you hear them, they're so simple. But if you really take them, into yourself and realize what they are and what they mean, when you watch the news or you hear people talk, you'll have these red flags all the time. Like that's not as strong a case as you think. Today I'm going to consider something specific related to statistics. And again, when you hear statistics or fallacies, you might think something like, "Oh, that's kind of boring, something that's in school." But the thing is you are inundated with information, and the worst type of information is the information that makes you think you have a good grasp of what's going on, but in reality, you don't know what's going on. It's like kind of being zealous without having knowledge. You have the feeling of being knowledgeable, and it'll stoke your kind of like pridefulness to say, "Oh, I know what's going on," but in reality, you might believe something that may have a very, very weak case. Okay. Mark Twain once quipped, "There are three kinds of lies: lies, damned lies, and statistics." Obviously, Twain is a very I guess, maxim maker. That is a very good quip. Um, but what we don't realize, unless we take a moment to think about it, is that we hear statistics all the time, especially on the news, and we often interpret them the wrong way, or we draw the wrong conclusions. So there's a few different cases. First off, we have to remember that causation and correlation are different things. If you hear a statistic, just because there is a number involved or a big number, like 80% of this or 60% of that, that doesn't necessarily mean there's a causal relationship between one factor and another. Now, of course, there could be, but whether something could be something is not an argument that something really is. It's not a strong argument. Okay, here's a few cases. All right, so do you know that 100% of all serial killers drink water? Do you drink water? Oh no, you might be a serial killer. Of course, that's absurd, right? Okay, so there's no relationship between drinking water and whether or not you're a serial killer. That should be obvious, right? Here's another case. If you and Jeff Bezos were in the waiting room for something, the average net worth for those in the waiting room would be around $50 billion, assuming you are worth around 0 billion. Now, if you think about that, now is it true that you're worth 50 billion? Well, no. It's just the case that Bezos is worth a ton, right? But on average, if you averaged it, you're worth a lot. But the thing is you don't actually have that money, right? Because the average is just a mathematical slicing in half. You go back to your elementary math. You add up the different things and you divide by the number of sets. It doesn't actually indicate what you have. Okay, but it might convince you that you have some knowledge, but in fact you don't. It's just a mathematical generalization. Okay, now here's a more elaborate case. 100% of a cartel family, let's say, is wealthy. This cartel derives its income from, let's say, horrible things like prostitution, violence, drug trafficking, etc. Are we justified in concluding that a member in the top cartel derives money from nefarious means? If yes, then why? So when you start using these things that are very loaded, okay, you start making all of these assumptions. Okay, it's very possible that in this case, there's something that doesn't fit in the normal TV show or movie plan. So, for instance, imagine if you were in a family and then you distance yourself from that family, and you lived a very honest life. That might sound strange, but people do strange things, right? Just because you're related to some family member doesn't necessarily mean that determines everything about you. Similar to my comments on racism, when you take a superficial attribute and treat it as something substantial, and then you just run with it, it's not actually a good argument. When you run with something superficial and treat it as substantial, then you're making some bad arguments. Okay. Now I'll give one more case and then I'll kind of take a step back. Um, when you consider statistics on like incarceration or something like that, um, if you assume that every group should have the exact same results, you're actually ascribing certain characteristics to the group based on their skin color or some superficial attribute. You can see my article on racism on commonphilosopher.com to look into that a little bit more. But the idea is that you might be making a mistake, even if you're well-intentioned, to assume things about certain groups positively, to say that, oh, this group should be this, and this group should be that, or these groups are different, but they should still have the exact same, statistics or something. You're ascribing information about that group, and you may not have any evidence for that assumption. Okay. All right. So I've given some different cases, and then we have our gut reactions, our kind of like uncritical thoughts to these things. But the underlying issue is that when you hear these statistics, just because you have some statistical number, that doesn't mean that there is a causal relationship between one thing and another. It may indicate something, but it doesn't mean that it's causal. Even things about like you hear these statistics like, you have a blank and blank chance of getting hit by a car. Okay, but you have to think about how those statistics are generated. Those keep all of the different types of drivers and they lump them in one thing. Okay, so for instance, when calculating a person's average lifespan in certain decades in the past or different centuries, if they calculate people that die when they're 1 year old and 5 years old or something like that, those averages will bring down the life expectancy. But the thing is when you're thinking about life expectancy, you're not really thinking about the children that just died of some disease as a part of that number. But that's where you get a lot of these misconceptions about like, oh, in the Middle Ages, they had the life expectancy of 25 or 30 years old. Now, to some degree, they're right. If you lump all the numbers together, it's true because more people died from, basically as infants. But if you take out those major considerations, when we think of, well, if I was a healthy adult, how long would I live? Almost, it's around 70, 80, 90 years old throughout human history. But the thing is you don't get that information if you are uncritical about how you lump all those numbers together. Okay, so I'm not proving anything positively. What I'm basically underlining is just because you have some strong sounding connection, a correlation, that doesn't mean that it's causal. Okay, and think about like the cautious driver. You can say, well, 1 in 10 people, I'm just throwing a number out here, 1 in 10 people are going to get in a car accident in their life. And these are just large statistics. But one thing is what that doesn't take into account is, well, how often do you drive? How cautious are you? How do you tailgate? So imagine if somebody drove every single day and tailgated. Their likelihood of getting in a car accident is much higher, and that you don't get any of that information from that statistic where they lump everybody together. There's another distinction when you study statistics is whether the sample is representative. If you make good decisions and you're cautious, you're already going to be set apart from the large group, this mathematical abstraction. If you're more cautious than other people, if you spend more energy on being safe, you are not going to fall in that broad generalization. Okay. There's so many ways that we can get the sense that we know what's going on, but in reality we don't. So I would definitely tread carefully when you hear anything about statistics. If you think that it's so simple, that it's just so obvious, especially like racism, sexism, economic stuff, there's a whole list of economic fallacies that people just don't take a moment to think about. Because there's some people that want to stoke things like envy and hatred, all of these different things. So take a step back, check out different news sources, if you hear a statistic, okay, I would recommend going to places like commonphilosopher.com or places that discuss these fallacies. Um, Take a step back. Always ask yourself, there is a connection between these numbers, but what is the connection? Is there a causal relationship between one thing and another? There may not be. Are there any other ways that you can explain a piece of data? Okay. Um, so, all right. So I tried to make this as lively as possible. One last point of just relevance. You are inundated with statistical information all the time. Okay. Uh, it's happening. You're getting it all the time. If you are not careful, you're going to be duped a lot. Okay. So that doesn't take the burden off doing research, taking a step back. Um, but there's statistics, and they make us think that we know what's going on. But very often we don't know what's going on. And it's better to mark, hey, I don't know exactly what causes this, or this is very interesting that this and this happen at the same time. Some interesting things like uh, in some cases in the summer, there's a correlation between ice cream sales and like murder rates. Um, is ice cream sales somehow related to murder rates? Well, if I remember the study right, it was something like, well, there actually is more violence when you have, really, really hot summers or something like that. And at the same time, what else sells really well in the summer? It would be something like ice cream. Now, does ice cream have any like positive causal force on, homicide? No, that doesn't seem clear. At least I don't see it. But you can imagine that if you didn't make these distinctions, you would have a lot of these arguments running around in your head, but they're not doing the work that you might think it would do. So, anyways, I hope you guys finish up your week nicely. Have a great weekend, and maybe check out your fallacies. I'm sure that would be very exciting. That's what I would do. All right, you guys have a great weekend.